Hello, and welcome to our RKL webinar series, Coronavirus and its Impact on People, Process, and Profit. Before we start today's call, we'd like to share a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. We will provide a link to the recording when it's available via email. All materials were emailed to registrants this morning. You can also find the materials on our Coronavirus Resource Center at rklcpa.com. All lines are muted and will remain muted during the webinar. Questions can be submitted using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. However, due to the size of the group today with more than 900 registrants, we'll only have time to address a few questions throughout the webinar. RKL clients who have questions specific to their organization should reach out directly to your RKL advisor. 1 hour of CPE in the field of business law will be issued to participants on this call. To be eligible for CPE, participants must be connected to the session, both audio and presentation for its entirety. Additionally, participants must answer 3 questions as elements of engagement through the polling feature. If you're viewing through a web browser, ensure you have pop-ups enabled. If the question does not show, just click the presentation screen and the question should display. If you're using multiple monitors, the poll may appear on your second screen. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Eric Wenger, who will introduce our team for today's webinar. Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steph, and good morning to everybody. We're glad you can join us here on this Friday morning. And this morning it will be, again, 3 of us presenting. Myself starting off with a discussion on PPP forgiveness guidance and some of the developments that have occurred since last week. Next up, Stephane Smith is rejoining us here again this week with some discussions from the human capital services side, workforce reinstatement, how do we bring employees back, a lot of questions that we're hearing from our clients. And Nick will finish off today with a discussion on the economic update, both nationally as well as Pennsylvania and locally. Before we hop into this, I just wanted to share and highlight the many folks that it takes to produce these webinars each week. There's 12 names on the screen at the moment that represent sort of the core team, but there's a whole army of people behind those names who also have a key role in terms of serving clients, doing analysis in our consulting group and other groups within their firm. So just a quick shout out to these names that you see on the screen here, and thank you for their ongoing support. The next screen, we just wanted to briefly share with you some exciting developments that have occurred over the past few weeks in terms of media exposure and the way that this whole series and the Coronavirus Resource Center has ultimately been leveraged. I'll start with the one on the left, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the note at the bottom there. Also, this same article appeared in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the Patriot News, LNP, Lancaster Online. That was a piece with coverage here in Pennsylvania, and perhaps more interestingly, on the right side of the screen, the New York Times, this past Sunday on the front page, we were featured, meaning the firm was featured as part of the resources that were utilized as they developed that article. Interestingly, the backstory there, they found a blog post that was part of our Coronavirus Resource Center. The reporter reached out and had an interview, and so you can browse that there. So thank you for the ongoing support of the audience that continues to join us each week as well. So we wanted to start off by talking about, I'm going to jump ahead just a couple slides and then I'll come back. Talk about some of the new FAQs. As you remember, the SBA's guidance has come out in the form of frequently asked questions, which they post online. There's not a more formal process. It's literally as simple as just going to the website, hitting refresh, and seeing if anything new has popped up in the last hour. At this moment, there are 45 FAQs. I just right now hit refresh. That's where it's been for the last 2 days, or the last day, I should say. So we'll talk about the ones that are new. And the first one that we want to talk about is FAQ number 43. And I'll just read this here. And basically what it's talking about is FAQ 31, reminded borrowers to review carefully the required certification on the borrower application that quoted the following: current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. And long story short, that phrase has caused a lot of angst with a lot of different organizations as they try to decipher what that means. Unfortunately, there's been very little guidance that is relevant to the private company market. There has been some guidance around public companies and basically saying you guys shouldn't take this money. When it comes to privately held companies, it's a lot more nebulous. And the answer to this FAQ is basically they are saying, initially they said, if you turn your money back in by May 7th, you can just assume that you never had applied. If you don't feel good about this, if you're not comfortable with it, just, turn it back by May 7th and you're good. What this discussion here this week says is if you turn your money back in by May 14, which is next Thursday, then, don't worry about it. Basically, no harm, no foul. The last sentence on the screen, I think, is extremely important, and that says the SBA intends to provide additional guidance on how it will review the certification prior to May 14th. So with any luck, sometime during this next week, we're going to get some clarity finally on what the SBA means by this economic uncertainty issue and the ongoing operations of the applicant issue, and that hopefully will allow companies to determine whether or not they wish to turn money back. At this point, our advice is to document, and I would say await this further guidance. The way that we're talking about documenting that, and now I'm just jumping back to the earlier slides, these 2 points. One, it would be a memo documenting your analysis of the factors related to your financial situation. The second is a cash flow forecast and sensitivity analysis. The objective here is to have some contemporaneous documentation that supports why did we believe that we were in a situation that warranted this. And you say, well, where do I start with that? I'm not going to read all the words on this screen, but there are a number of things here that you can consider, both from a macroeconomic standpoint, broad economy, things in your industry, things in the local market, perhaps a change in your products, your services, your suppliers, shortages, revenue forecasts, all these variety of different factors that would help to craft a story around how you have been impacted by COVID, and in turn how that allows PPP loan access. Secondly would be a forecast concept, and this would be looking at budgeting, forecasting, cash flow. What does this mean for going forward? A lot of companies are making comments like, yeah, I can weather the next 8 weeks. That's not my concern. My concern is third quarter or fourth quarter this year, or maybe even next year. And so to the extent that companies are tapping into lines of credit beyond where they normally would be, essentially to fund losses, what does that mean for their viability down the road when they may typically have a higher line of credit? So again, with the guidance that's expected here in the next week, hopefully we'll be able to determine how nervous companies should be. Our sense at this point is that they're simply going after those who have been completely egregious or committed fraud. There is a case out of New England up in Massachusetts about some fraudsters that basically, made up a whole bunch of stuff and got a loan or attempted to get a loan, and they're being prosecuted. On the other side of the litigation coin, there are actually some lawsuits, one that was cited in California this week, of companies going after the SBA and saying, hey, we made decisions about retaining employees and we spent money with an understanding that the provisions of this program were going to stand. Now that you, SBA, have given further guidance, you've cost us money. So it's interesting. There's litigation on both sides of this, and the attorneys will be kept busy. Next FAQ is number 44, and this is more for companies that have employees outside the U.S. Again, not a ton of relevance to many companies, but if you have employees outside the U.S., initially the guidance said, just worry about counting your employees in the U.S., and to the extent that you have fewer than 500, you're good. I should say 500 or fewer. Now the SBA just a couple days ago said, oh yeah, actually you do need to worry about counting your foreign employees as well. So if this is your situation, certainly reach out. We need to have some more dialogue around this. FAQ 45. This point is saying, is an employer that repays its PPP loan by the safe harbor date, which is now May 14th, to turn the money back, are they eligible for the employee retention credit? And the answer is yes. And so that's an important distinction. Initially, if you get PPP money, you can't claim some of these credits. And the employee retention credit, you may recall, is $5,000 per employee. So there is an analysis to be done to say, if I don't really get that much benefit from PPP, then maybe I want to look at, turning the money back and becoming eligible for some of these other credits. Next point, we touched on this very briefly last week. Is PPP forgiveness tax-free or not? In the CARES Act, and initially all the press around this was, yeah, this is tax-free forgiveness. And that was believed to be congressional intent, and it was pretty clear that that was the discussion, that if you are forgiven of a loan, that is tax-free. What's really interesting is that Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and by the way, Treasury has oversight of the IRS, he came out and said, guys, you're forgetting about Code Section 265. 265 has been in the code for a long time, and the point of 265 is basically to say if you have tax-free income or tax-exempt income that you're reporting, and you have expenses incurred to generate tax-exempt income, well, then you can't deduct the expenses. And this is not a new provision, but this is now the Treasury Secretary saying, if you're going to pay payroll, as an example, and ultimately the federal government is going to cover the cost of that payroll, well, then that was tax. Yes, the loan itself is tax-free income, but they're arguing it from the expense side and saying you've incurred expenses that are no longer deductible because of 265. The third bullet point, congressional response, there's a whole bunch of folks in Congress that are pushing back and saying, no, wait a minute, that's not what we wanted to have happen. So right now there's a little bit of tug of war going on between the legislative branch and the administrative branch, which includes Treasury. Right now, honestly, I believe Treasury Secretary is correct in his interpretation of 265. But if Congress says, well, that's not really how we don't want 265 to apply in this instance, then they need to do something about that. And we'll see whether or not that becomes part of a future stimulus package. Quick comment for nonprofits on the line. There was some question about whether or not these PPP loans that are going to nonprofits might subject those nonprofits to a single audit requirement. The long and short of this is, the answer is no, PPP funding will not push you over that $750,000 level that would normally subject you to a single audit. There is an important distinction if you have an economic injury disaster loan, the nonprofit has applied and received one of those, that could still subject you to a single audit requirement. So nonprofits, just keep that in mind. Broadly, PPP is exempt. I want to spend some time here with a somewhat detailed example, but I think it's extraordinarily important because I will say that our team has been having a lot of conversations with companies. And yes, there is a ton of ambiguity out there around the specific detailed rules, but at the same time, there's some broad things that we just want to make sure that everybody is grasping here. And the way that I framed this up is to do an example one, which I'm calling the traditional wise business owner approach, also known as the hunker down and survive approach. And I'm going to tell you the punchline first before we go through the detail. The punchline is, in both scenarios, the company got a $2.5 million loan. In example one, the company is going to end up repaying back $2.4 million of that loan. All but $100,000 is going to be paid back. Example two, I'm calling the non-traditional business owner approach, AKA conduit in lieu of unemployment. And in that scenario, 2.4 of the 2.5 million is eligible for forgiveness. And here's why. So let's run through this. Payroll and benefits costs of $1 million a month. We're going to assume that there's 240 employees that each make equally $50,000 for simplicity. That's how they got a $2.5 million loan, 2.5 months at $1 million. Remember the 8-week period, it's 8 weeks, which means 56 days. So that for them, we're going to say it starts on May 1st. It runs them through June 25th. We're going to assume these overhead items of interest, rent, and utilities, which are forgivable under the program, are $300,000 a month. And here's the unfortunate thing, and many companies are in this boat. The business is closed by the governor and does not anticipate being able to open, in their case, until July 1st, which is after their 8-week period. So what's the company done in the meantime? Well, they furloughed 80% of their employees. So of the 240 employees, 192 people got laid off and presumably are collecting unemployment. And as a result, instead of paying $1 million a month, we're now only paying $200,000 per month in employee costs. And as a result, we're at $200,000 of monthly expenses for payroll times 2 months. This 56 days versus 60 days would be 93%, which is how we're getting this number from $400,000 down to $373,000. So we can say, okay, we've incurred qualified payroll of $373,000. The other consideration is you recall that 75% of your forgiveness has to go to personnel costs, which means when you do the math on that, our eligible overhead costs are only $124,000. So remember these two figures, 373, 124. On the next slide, we see our loan started at 2.5 million. We paid benefits of 373. We paid overhead of 124. So preliminarily, we spent almost $500,000 toward eligible costs. But this FTE haircut comes in a big way because we got rid of 80% of our workforce. We now need to reduce our eligible spending by 80%. So we just took a haircut for $400,000, which means we are only eligible for $100,000 in round numbers of forgiveness, which is 4% of our original loan. So the company that's all excited that they got a $2.5 million loan, in reality, after you work this math through, they only get forgiven $100,000. They're going to owe back $2.4 million. Let's go now to example 2. It's the exact same facts, except right here in bold, the company is going to pay its employees at a normal rate for the 8-week period, including those 240 people that previously were furloughed. And honestly, here it doesn't matter if they can do work, if they can't do work, if they stay home and do nothing, or if you give them other various projects that may be beneficial to the business. The point is we're retaining the payroll. And so when we do the math, we still have our $1 million a month for 2 months. That 93% factor relates to the 56 days. So we incur here $1.8 million in payroll. Our overhead, again, because we have higher payroll, we can get more overhead cost. Our overhead could be as high as $622,000. Our actual overhead was only $558,000, so that's our lesser number. Again, remember $1.8 million and $558,000. We go to the next slide. We've had a $2.5 million loan. Here's our $1.8 million. Here's our $558,000. So we spent 2.4 of the 2.5 on qualified costs, which means 75,000 was not qualified. We have no FTE haircut because we got everybody back. And in turn, we got 97% of our original loan forgiven. In summary, what does this mean? Well, first, we paid payroll in example 1. This was the bare bones method. The required payroll for our 20% of our employees was 373. We were incurring actual costs to keep going with our overhead of 558. We paid 931. We were forgiven only $100,000, so we're out of pocket 831 in cash. In example 2, we paid the same required payroll for those key employees, the 20% folks, but we paid the 80% to either stay home or do some other stuff for us, depending, it doesn't really matter. We incurred the same payroll or the same overhead. We've paid $2.4 million. We've been forgiven, presumably $2.4 million. So you can see a really bizarre result, which is basically by paying the extra payroll, even if it wasn't for doing specific tasks, we got a lot more forgiveness. Key takeaways here. Number 1, many, and I would say even maybe most, organizations are going to receive less than 100% loan forgiveness. Part of this is because of the 56-day issue. Part of it is because of the paid and incurred issue. And it's just mighty hard unless your payroll has gone up quite a bit over the prior year. Chances are you're going to get something less than 100% of loan forgiveness. Number 2, there's been some public outcry that says this is ridiculous. You know, why is our 8-week period starting when our business is shut down because of the state level governor orders? Unfortunately, I think this is exactly the point of the program. Based on what Congress was intending, it was, we want our employees to continue to receive money and in lieu of unemployment, whether or not your business can function. So that's an important distinction to remember, and that's part of the reason why I think that 8-week period is unlikely to shift. Number 3, PPP forgiveness has a multiplier effect. And in this instance, spending $1 less on payroll could actually cost you more than $1. We saw that in the previous examples. Stated another way, reducing headcount by, in my example, 80% will reduce your overall loan forgiveness by more than 80%. I believe in my example, it was 96%, and that's because of those haircut tests, and we saw how that worked. So keep that in mind. Number 4, traditional business wisdom and logic may need to be suspended to maximize PPP forgiveness. Your organization may achieve increased PPP forgiveness by viewing itself as a conduit of government funds so that your employees will avoid collecting unemployment. And this, I think, is important to remember. That's really the mindset that may need to be employed if your objective is to maximize your PPP forgiveness. Number 5, when will the SBA provide more clarity on the host of open questions? What if we make a decision today that proves to be the wrong decision because of SBA guidance that hasn't even come out yet? That's a real issue. We are grappling with that the same as our clients are, and so we just have to be aware that that's out there. Number 6, there's a lot of lack of clarity around incurred and paid, and we need guidance on that badly because companies are trying to maximize forgiveness, and still the SBA has not really opined on that issue in any level of detail, I should say. Number 7, at what point might a company jeopardize forgiveness if only a small percentage of the loan proceeds are ultimately expended on payroll costs? This is an unknown, but the point is, if you have a big $2.5 million loan and you only spend a small portion of it on payroll, at some point are you jeopardizing the intent of that loan and perhaps even risking any forgiveness? That we do not know. Number 8, when might it make more sense to abandon the PPP loan in order to claim the employee retention tax credits? That's what I mentioned earlier on. So that option, again, abandoning the PPP would mean that by next Thursday, you would make a decision to say, forget it, I don't want this money, I'd rather take the credits. Number 9, what about week number 9? And the point here is, this is great. Okay, we can do all this for 8 weeks, but what happens if at week 9, I need to lay off my people again? Do we want to subject our workforce to that kind of undue stress or uncertainty, this yo-yo effect of, okay, now you're back, now you're not, just that whole human issue. And number 10, and this is an important point, every organization has its own fact pattern and risk factors. There is no one-size-fits-all for PPP. And spend the time, run your scenarios, understand what it means in your situation. Certainly, if you need help with that, we're able to help with that, but it's not a one-size-fits-all by any stretch. With that, let's go to polling question number 1. To be eligible for CPE, 3 of our questions today will need to be answered. We typically add a 4th at the very end of the session. That one would also qualify if you wish. Number 1, have you considered returning your PPP funding by the May 14 deadline? The options here, yes, no, or NA. Our organization did not receive a PPP loan. Again, on all of our polling questions, there's no right or wrong, just respond, and that will allow you to get CPE credit. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Stephane Smith.
Thank you, Eric. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into some of those frequently asked questions that we're getting regarding reinstating your workforce. Here, if I can advance. Seem to be stuck on my slide here. Sorry about that. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and keep going in the interest of time, and hopefully we can work out our kinks here. But the first one that we have is, my business was awarded PPP loan, and we have to recall our employees. However, 2 of my employees refused to return to work. Does that mean we are no longer eligible for full forgiveness? So according to the updated guidance we received this week from the SBA, employers who demonstrate a good faith effort to bring back laid off employees onto their payroll, even if an employee declines the offer, is still eligible for full forgiveness. There we go. The employer should provide the recall notice to the employees in writing and document an employee's failure to return. The employer is also required to notify the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry by submitting the UC 1921 refusal for suitable work form within 7 days of those employees refusing work for their unemployment collection of insurance. Next here, I provided 2 sources of documentation. The document on the left is a sample recall notice that I've shared in previous webinars. And the document on the right is a recall tracking sheet to keep track of the communications that you've had with your employees. This tracking sheet can be provided to your lender as a proof of the recall, along with any methods of attempts that you've made to reach out to your employees. You want to make sure that you maintain a copy of the letter that you send as backup documentation if necessary. I recommend at least 2 forms of contact. So for example, you may call the employee, but then follow up with a letter just to make sure that you've made that good faith effort. My county has moved into the yellow zone. Do I have to bring all of my employees back, or can some still telecommute? So per Governor Wolf's guidelines issued on May 4th for the state of Pennsylvania, businesses that have been operating remotely or in whole or in part through individual telework with their employees must continue to telework to prevent the spread of COVID-19 until the stay-at-home and business closure orders are lifted. So businesses should comply with the relevant regulations defining who should stay at home and who should return to the physical workplace. Okay. I operate a business that is unable to adhere to the social distancing guidelines at this time. What should I do? So businesses serving the public that inherently involve close contact with customers and therefore cannot attain social distancing are not permitted to conduct in-person operations until the county where their business is located transitions to that green phase when the building safety and business safety orders are lifted. I'm concerned about some of my employees and their ability to cope with the stress of everything. What can I do to help? So whoever submitted this question is certainly not alone. We are hearing a lot about the struggles that our clients are dealing with. And here we are 2 months into this quarantine order in the state of Pennsylvania, and many are struggling to maintain that ability to cope with the isolation. They're finding themselves at a breaking point. So help is available for people who are struggling with their mental and emotional health, as well as if they're feeling anxious or overly stressed and overwhelmed. So if you have an employee assistance program, I encourage you to share the information with all of your employees. But here I have listed some additional resources that are available nationally, as well as in the state of Pennsylvania and Lancaster County. So if you're out of the area, I strongly encourage you to research your local intervention resources. We have an employee who started showing signs of illness while at work. We sent the employee home immediately. How do we go about notifying the other employees who may have been in contact with this person? So first, you'll need to identify who was in close contact with the employee. You want to utilize like a contact tracing tool to track that exposure. You'll want to identify those who had contact with the employee 48 hours prior to the symptoms starting, and then all the way up until the employee was isolated. You'll need to identify those who were within 6 feet of the infected person for more than 10 minutes. So immediately notify those who were exposed while maintaining confidentiality and encourage them to follow exposure procedures. Those without significant exposure are recommended to self-monitor for symptoms for up to 14 days. And then if symptoms develop, the employee should notify if you have a designated worksite contact or their supervisor immediately. And of course, they must stay home. This slide illustrates examples of 2 forms related to contact tracing. The form on the left is an employee daily contact tracking form. So you may want to develop a form for your business that you can ask your employees to use and keep track of anybody that they've had contact with throughout the day. So that's a proactive approach. So if you get to the point of needing to fill out the contact tracing form because someone has potentially been exposed, that will ensure that no one is inadvertently overlooked and that you'll be able to indicate when you contacted them and the date that you shared the positive or negative test result. By taking this proactive approach, you can stay on top of mitigating the spread of the coronavirus throughout your entire business. So can you share some of what your clients are doing to prepare for reopening? It's always nice to get a feel of what other organizations are doing and get a gauge whether you're on target or if you need to consider taking some additional measures. So here's a short sample list of what we've been hearing from our clients. Many are continuing to telework even if they can return back to business. Since they've been able to maintain business continuity throughout this process, there's no rush to get back to that brick and mortar office space. We also have a client that's preparing to implement some flexible work arrangement options for their telecommuters. So in order to help them to find a reasonable work-life balance, they're finding that some of their employees are putting in long hours and are starting to burn out. So the intent is to allow them to determine a work schedule that works best for them and then for them to find that balance at home and between work. So for someone, it might be starting at 7 a.m. and wrapping up at 1, but then logging on later in the evening once their children are in bed. Or for others, it could be just blocking off 2 hours in the middle of the day to accomplish whatever they need to, and then logging back in later in the afternoon. Other businesses are assigning arrival times to their employees. They are designating a single point of entry into the building, and they're staggering work shifts. Some are asking employees to hang an occupied sign on the restroom door to limit it to one person at a time. If you have a large restroom with multiple stalls, you might want to consider something like that. We have a lunchroom where employees congregate, eat lunch, get coffee. Should we allow employees to utilize our lunchroom? So per the guidelines that were issued by the president, the recommendation is to close common areas where employees are likely to congregate and interact, or enforce moderate social distancing protocols. So you may be able to create adequate social distancing if you have a really large lunchroom. You'll have to make that determination for yourself. So you should also want to communicate to your employees what will be available, what are they familiar, what are they used to having supplied to them, you know, cups and utensils, coffee, beverages, things along those lines. You may want to have your employees bring a packed lunch in an insulated cooler to avoid keeping food in a refrigerator that would be utilized by everybody. You also may want to encourage them to bring their own coffee and their own utensils. Perhaps, you know, if you can, stagger your workforce into half-day shifts and end at the lunch hour, and then the next shift can start just after the lunch hour to avoid the need to utilize the lunchroom. Okay, so our business is a large office building with multiple elevators. How should we manage employee usage? So depending on the number of people coming and going, you may want to assign an existing employee or hire someone to manage social distancing while people are waiting to get on the elevator, and also limit the number of people that get into the elevator. Perhaps you assign an attendant, someone who would be responsible for designating where riders stand and also be the only person to touch any of the buttons. You should post visible signs in multiple locations that detail elevator use protocols, including passenger limits, as well as place floor markers to indicate where passengers should stand to maintain that safe distance. You'll also want to make sure that you implement a regular elevator cleaning process and ensure that regular disinfecting of high-touch surfaces such as handrails and buttons occur. We've made a lot of changes to policies in our employee handbook as it relates to COVID-19. Should we have our employees sign a new acknowledgement form? This is an excellent point. As you prepare to resume business, you want to make sure that you conduct a thorough review of your company policies, make any edits as necessary to ensure that they're consistent with public health recommendations related to coronavirus and the existing state and federal laws. And it's also a good idea to obtain a signed acknowledgement form from each employee to affirm that they've read and understand the revised policies and procedures. So as you communicate with your existing or recalled workforce, it's a good idea to explain the why behind what you're implementing or changing in order to get that full buy-in from all of your employees. You want to make sure that you are clear about communicating what policies or procedures are permanent and those that are temporary. For some companies, the ability to telecommute is only a temporary solution, and the employees should know what to expect when they can expect that policy would terminate. Okay, so lastly here, this is a great question. How do we regain the trust and confidence of our furloughed employees? So when it comes time to start bringing back your employees that were furloughed or laid off, there will likely be a sense of relief for both the employees and for the employer, eager to be productive and find financial relief. However, those aren't the only emotions that they're going to feel. There will be a period of adjustment for everyone. You may even notice some trepidation, some excitement or anxiety, or perhaps even anger. The reality is that the landscape has changed. Some employees won't be returning, and those that do are faced with adjusting to the new normal. Expect a period of mourning, so to speak, related to no longer working alongside colleagues as they have in the past, that they've developed those long-term relationships or friendships with, and as well as mourning the way that things used to be. It's going to be different at work going forward. You want to develop a thorough change management strategy that will be helpful as you plan your return, and set expectations with your returning workforce. Try to anticipate what may make your employees feel anxious or areas that they will have questions about. If you're only able to bring back part of your workforce, explain why particular positions were brought back and others were not. Acknowledging emotions and continuing to provide open and honest communication will help rebuild trust. Reassure your employees of their value and the importance of their contribution to your organization. It's good practice to maintain frequent communication across various platforms. You're better off erring on the side of over-communication during these times. So that's going to conclude my frequently asked questions session. Before we transfer over to Nick, we're going to take a moment here for another polling question. So as a reminder, to be eligible for CPE, at least 3 polling questions must be answered. Okay, so do you know what to do if your employee refuses to return to work? Yes, no, or I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you, Steph. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. Here's a quick agenda of what we're going to cover. I'm going to walk you through some updates on COVID-19, cover the status of state orders, the U.S. economy, small business, fiscal and monetary stimulus, and then a little bit of coverage on PA and the regional economy. So obviously that's a lot to cover. I'm going to try to move pretty quickly here. If you have any questions on any of this, please feel free to reach out and follow up afterward. We're happy to go into more detail. So here are the realities of the COVID-19 figures to put them into some kind of perspective. The numbers you see in the shaded columns in the middle are the numbers from this morning. The global figures on the left, US figures are on the right. We're approaching 4 million confirmed cases globally and over 1.2 million confirmed cases in the US. Deaths are now approaching 270,000 globally, and we're now at nearly 77,000 deaths in the US. As we've noted before, COVID-19 brings a bit of a double whammy. It's an absolute tragedy. What you can see here is that it's more infectious than SARS and MERS, which are on the left, but it's also more fatal than the swine flu or the seasonal flu, which you can see figures for on the right. Of course, some studies have suggested the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases are vastly understated, which would mean that the fatality rate is much, much lower than this, but ultimately we still don't really have any clear definitive answers on that from public health officials. So those are the numbers. We've probably all seen this graphic by now. It came from the President's Coronavirus Task Force. The initial public health goal here was to slow the spread in order to flatten the curve, as I'm sure you've heard extensively. We do appear to have flattened the curve significantly. The one thing this slide shows us is in the much smaller, flatter curve in light blue, that's what the task force has been projecting as a range of total deaths from COVID-19. You can see the range in 100,000 to 240,000. The IHME model is still tracking this and suggesting about 134, 135,000 total deaths through August. So another look at the data. One of the sources we've been tracking here shows that we have indeed flattened the curve across the United States. The chart on the left is the daily new cases. The chart on the right is daily new deaths. The dark line there is the 7-day moving average, and obviously you can see it hasn't come down significantly, but it is showing a declining trend. Obviously, everyone's hoping for those numbers to decline more rapidly than this, but for now, at least the data certainly seem to have stabilized. So this is the U.S. status by state. Where does this put us in terms of stay-at-home orders? Here's a map of the U.S. with status of each state by color. The red states are in full lockdown. The tan color states are in partial lockdown. And the white states are ones that were never put into a statewide shutdown. And then the light blue states are states that have reopened. The star on Pennsylvania there is because it's showing in this map as being in lockdown, although, as you all know, technically as of today, some counties have moved into phase yellow and have begun to reopen. We'll look at that Pennsylvania detail a little bit later. For now, if you include PA in the partial lockdown category in the tan, what you can see here is that about 55% of US GDP is still in lockdown. So states in partial lockdown make up about 38% of GDP, and among those states that are open, they represent only about 7% of GDP. So obviously the majority of US economic activity here is still under restriction. So what does that mean for the U.S. economy? As we've noted before, what drives the U.S. economy is the U.S. consumer. The red box in the chart on the left, you can see that first quarter GDP fell by almost 5%. The colored bar chart on the right side of this slide shows the components of GDP. And in the red circle, you can see there that even after a significant drop in consumer spending in the first quarter, roughly 68% of U.S. GDP still comes from the consumer. So the most important measure of the health of the consumer is the employment picture. This here slide shows us again that the U.S. consumer and the economy were on very healthy footing heading into the pandemic. The gray line shows unemployment, the blue line shows wage growth. What you can see here, prior to the pandemic, unemployment was at 50-year lows and real wages were growing at a very strong clip. Obviously, the employment picture has changed very rapidly given the shutdown. This chart provides a snapshot of that. This one shows U.S. payroll employment going back 15 years up through March. Again, you can see that up until this event, the trend was very strong and healthy. The number in the red circle there was one of the more favorable estimates that economists were predicting would happen in terms of job losses in April. They're showing a decline in U.S. payrolls of about 20 million. We have that data, and we'll get to that in a minute. This chart here, of course, shows the impact that kind of a reduction in payroll employment could have on the unemployment rate. The estimation here was 17% unemployment rate based on that kind of decline in jobs. These are levels that we haven't experienced since the Great Depression, and of course are very grim. One of the areas of hope, however, was that many of the workers would be furloughed and potentially would be able to return to their jobs after the pandemic had settled down. This chart shows U.S. workers on temporary layoff as a percentage of the total unemployed. So you can see here in the purple, that figure skyrocketed in March and was up 26.5%. Ultimately, here are the actual numbers from a critical data release this morning. What you can see here is that these numbers are nothing short of tragic. They're among the worst in history. That said, there are some meaningfully positive takeaways. Most of the figures were actually better than economists had been estimating. These are all employment data. They were released at 8:30 this morning. In the red box, you can see the survey number. That's what the consensus estimate was prior to the release. In the green box, you can see what the actual numbers were today. So there are some pretty notable figures in here, which I'm going to spend a minute on. At the top, you can see the decline in non-farm payrolls was estimated to show a decline of 22 million. It came in at 20.5 million. That's still an awful figure, but it's 1.5 million less than the consensus forecast. You come down to the third row, the change in private payrolls. Those were also estimated to decline 22 million, came in at 19.5 million. So that was, 2.5 million less than the consensus forecast there. Of course, one row below that is manufacturing. You can see the change in manufacturing payrolls. They were expected to decline 2.5 million. They declined by 13.3 million. So, again, over 1 million below consensus. One row below that is, of course, the unemployment rate. So that's where the consensus estimate was 16%, and the figure came in at 14.7%. So while it's not shown here, one of the things we could find in the report was that roughly 18 million people reported that they were on temporary layoff. It's difficult to measure, but it's likely that some of that reflects the effect of the PPP and employers generally furloughing workers rather than completely and permanently laying them off. In a typical recession, these unemployed tend to become permanent job losses. So no doubt some of these layoffs will turn into permanent job losses, but there are some encouraging signs in this report that the employment picture may improve more quickly than a typical recession once the lockdowns are eased. So those are the employment data. This is another encouraging sign for the U.S. consumer. This chart here shows U.S. household debt as a percentage of GDP. The purple circle there shows where we are heading, where we were heading into 2020 at 74%. This is still above the long-term average, which you can see is that line in white. It's been a very positive trend as households have deleveraged considerably since the great financial crisis. You can see there, the red scale shows that figure has come down 24% since 2009. So that shows a very steady and important improvement in consumer balance sheets. In addition to household debt, you can see U.S. consumer savings in this chart. This shows the consumer savings rate as a percent of disposable income. This too is headed in a healthier direction since the financial crisis. It was trending right around 8%. It jumped sharply in March, and obviously that was partly due to the inability of consumers to spend as freely in a lockdown. However, at the end of the day, this is very positive support for consumer balance sheets and the prospect of a quicker return to consumption and investment once the pandemic settles and lockdowns are opened up. There has been some speculation among economists that the savings rate will continue to remain high after the pandemic based on meaningful changes in consumer behavior going forward. That said, we're somewhat skeptical of that outcome. We'll continue to monitor that and see how that goes. Switching gears to small business, this looks at the impact on small business who have obviously been hit the hardest. This updated chart here shows data from a company called Homebase, which is a scheduling tool used by small businesses to manage their employees. It includes data from timesheets, schedules, payrolls, etc. You can see here that hours worked by hourly employees fell off sharply since mid-March. Industries have begun to gradually bring back up the hours of their hourly employees, albeit quite slowly. The sector breakout shows the significant amount of variance by industry. You can see that hourly employees in the beauty and personal care industry, which are shown in the bottom in red, they've been hit the hardest, while other sectors like home and repair, which is the turquoise color at the top, have fared better than others. You can also see here professional services in green, retail in dark blue, food and drink in gray, and leisure and entertainment in purple. So this is a similar chart, but just shows the percent change in the number of hourly employees working rather than their hours. This is the number of employees. It shows a similar conclusion. A number of hourly employees working fell off sharply since mid-March. Some industries have begun to gradually bring those employees back to work. Again, workers in beauty and personal care industry have fared the worst. That's in the red there at the bottom. Other industries like home and repair have fared better, which is turquoise. You can also see professional services, retail, food and drink, leisure and entertainment in here, and how they've fared relative to one another. One more similar chart. This is a different metric. It shows the percentage of change in the number of local businesses open. It hasn't actually returned quite as much as hours worked or hourly employees working. It shows a similar conclusion though. Obviously, from mid-March through April, most small businesses were hit very hard from the shutdown. Ultimately, with some parts of the economy having reopened, April is likely to be the bottom in these figures, but this is what we'll continue to monitor for signs of small business activity. One other thing that we'll be looking at for small business activity is the NFIB Small Business Optimism Index. So obviously, April was an awful month for small business. We're going to be watching this closely. This is historically a very good proxy for small business economic activity. The purple circle shows where we were at the end of March at 96.4, which was reasonably strong, all things considered, despite running still below the long-term average, which you can see in white. The key here will be that we expect this number to come down very sharply in April. That data is scheduled to be released on May 12th. The current expectation is for that to fall down around 86.5. That obviously will bring us near or below the red line, which represents the lows on this index for past recessions and crises, of course, most recently, the 2008 financial crisis. The key here in watching this metric will be getting a gauge on sentiment and optimism for small business and how they're feeling and doing in all this. We'll be watching how low does this figure go, how quickly does it recover. That'll give us some clarity around how small businesses are doing and should give us a sense of their prospect and the way they feel about the prospects of reopening, the stimulus money, and what their future outlook shows. One point of positivity and encouragement we're seeing is this chart. As we've been saying, this is not a financial crisis. What you can see here are U.S. bank loans. Credit has continued to flow into the economy, and we continue to be very encouraged by this figure. This chart shows C&I loans across the U.S. Obviously, you can see there they've skyrocketed. Banks have already increased lending by over 624 billion since March. So importantly, the latest data here doesn't still include all of the PPP program that's begun to ramp up, and there are other Treasury and Fed programs that will continue to add to this. But obviously, that's an unprecedented number and a very sharp and encouraging increase. Perhaps even more encouraging than that is this chart, which shows the U.S. money supply. What you're seeing here is an 18.5% increase in April in the U.S. money supply. And you can see there in the purple that increase represents $2.7 trillion since March. That's a staggering chart when you put it into context. It's nothing short of a tidal wave of money that's been injected into the economy. That ultimately has gone and will continue to go back into the economy, whether it be in consumer bank accounts or businesses or other areas of the economy, including investment. But what does all this stimulus ultimately add up to? What you can see here is, this table here shows the global monetary and fiscal stimulus that has been added since February. You can see the most recent amounts for the U.S. in the red box. On the left, the Federal Reserve has provided $4.8 trillion, or roughly 22% of GDP. In the middle, the U.S. federal government is now up to $3.3 trillion in stimulus, or over 15% of GDP. And then you can see the total there of $8.1 trillion in stimulus that accounts for nearly 38% of U.S. GDP. Again, this is important because while shutting down the economy has led to an historic collapse in employment and wages, as we have seen, the size of this stimulus is also completely unprecedented and historic. This is, as we've noted before, significantly more stimulus by an order of magnitude than we saw in the great financial crisis. One other thing is at the bottom of this chart, you can see that this lists other countries around the world. You can see at the very bottom globally, the numbers are also very large. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that almost 19 trillion in global stimulus has accounted or makes up or represents 21.8% of global GDP there. So what does all this mean for the economy? These charts here I've shown before. They show a V-shaped recovery in the top left, a U-shaped recovery in the top right, and on the bottom is the worst case outcome, which is an L-shaped recovery. Of course, there's significant discussion about which one we'll experience. What this table here shows is that most economists are forecasting that we get a V-shaped recovery. You can see in the red box there, this is real GDP. The orange numbers are actual figures that have already been posted, where the white ones are forecasts. You can see that the consensus estimate is for a decline of 27.5% GDP in the second quarter. That would be followed here in terms of the estimate by a very strong and nearly 10% rebound in third quarter activity, and then another very healthy figure in the fourth quarter of almost 7%. So this slide here just shows a recent forecast by Cornerstone Macro, suggests a similarly bad second quarter, shows growth returning positive pretty quickly. In the top right-hand corner of the chart in red, you can see they're estimating here that we would return to a pre-pandemic level of GDP in the fourth quarter of 2021. At the end of the day, it's impossible to predict exactly what this outcome will be. We know it'll be largely driven by how quickly we reopen the economy. One thing that gives us hope, this slide here shows research by JP Morgan, which lends some credibility to the V-shaped outcome. This shows that apart from the great financial crisis, every modern recession was followed by a V-shaped recovery. So it shows those in 69, 73, 80, 81, 90, 2001, and 07. You can see that only the great financial crisis was the exception in terms of a V-shaped recovery. The rest of those recessions, we quickly came out of it. So one of the reasons why we're optimistic, we're not entirely sure whether it'll be a V-shaped or a U, but we're optimistic that it won't be an L, and that's because it's still not a financial crisis. What you can see here is that these are U.S. financial conditions since January 1 of 2020. That lower line on the left here shows the looser financial conditions, and then ultimately as it gets higher, those are tighter financial conditions. You can see financial conditions were very loose at the start of the year, and then the pandemic hit and they tightened up. You can see they moved up over 3% in just a few weeks. Then following all the federal government and Federal Reserve stimulus, financial conditions eased up again and came back down almost 2%. So here they are today at 90.3. The stimulus brought financial conditions. Same data, but a longer term chart. You can see this shows the index going back 30 years. You can see the purple circle is where we are today. The white line is the 30-year average, so we're right about at the 30-year average. The red line is where past financial crises have occurred, the sharpest of which was 2008 financial crisis. But as you can see, financial conditions have become tight here for a little while and then have eased, but we are a very, very long way away from a financial crisis. So that's an important support for the U.S. economy and speaks to potentially our ability to recover more quickly. So that brings us to our polling question. Please indicate whether you'd like RKL to cover any of these economic topics on a future webinar. Check all that apply. Global economy, including international emerging markets, oil markets, the food supply, U.S. housing industry, federal government fiscal condition, or no additional coverage is needed. Those are not topics that we can cover in a little bit more detail, potentially on future webinars. So moving along to and switching gears to the Pennsylvania stuff, what you can see here is this is the Pennsylvania status by county. This slide is an update from one that we showed last week, showing that the yellow counties here are the ones that are moving to phase yellow today, while all these other counties in blue that have the red and orangish yellow circles, these counties are the ones that would move to yellow based on the case trend metric. You can see the case trend metric showing up in all of those figures. Ultimately, we do know that that's, of course, not everything that's being looked at by the governor and his team. They're looking at other factors to make their decisions. We would just note that in terms of the difference between last week is that all of the counties, with the exception of Lackawanna, have showed a decline in this metric from last week. So this gives us a good snapshot of GDP by county in Pennsylvania. You can see it's GDP share by county as a percentage of PA total GDP. This shows us where it puts us in terms of economic activity. The key here is that 91% of PA GDP comes from counties that are still in the red phase. While some of these states have begun to reopen today, the counties in yellow phase still represent less than 10% of PA's total economic activity. So this here shows the unemployment rate and claims by county. Just like the national economy, the consumer and of course the employment picture is a key to PA's economic success. This map shows the PA unemployment rate by county, and you can see those numbers in the white circles. Those are the unemployment rates as of March 2020. The chart in the top left shows the recent trend in unemployment claims by some of the counties that are represented in the map. Ultimately, the key here is that the impact of the pandemic and shutdown have been pretty uneven across counties in PA. What traditionally happens is that counties with more diverse economies tend to hold up better in recessions. So when you look at these individual numbers on a county by county basis, some of this increase in unemployment is a function of population, but the counties with fewer businesses and diverse sets of industry where jobs are concentrated in a few sectors or even a few larger employers, they tend to get the hardest. We do find it encouraging that in the chart at the top left here, that claims ultimately have been very high, but the trend is coming down. So certainly the pace at which these economies open up and these counties can open up, that'll determine the forward trend of business shutdowns, unemployment, and this trend in claims. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. Switching slides here. This is the PA economy by industry. This chart shows PA economy's GDP in blue employment figures in gray, and the number of establishments in orange by sector. We won't spend a lot of time getting into the detail here in each industry. The key is that while some sectors like healthcare are significantly larger than other industries, Pennsylvania enjoys a broadly diversified economy. This is very healthy and will provide some meaningful support and upside in the recovery. And finally, this is PA unemployment claims by industry. So we drill into the industries a little closer. This shows the claims by industry. Again, we won't spend time on each one. As you can see, some sectors like leisure and hospitality, trade, transportation, and utilities, and education and healthcare that were quite strong heading into the pandemic, they've been hit much harder than others. So at the end of the day, while the diversity of the PA economy is a strength, and these sectors, they may come back strongly in the recovery, but ultimately smaller businesses in those sectors, among all these sectors, remain at risk, particularly in the event of a prolonged shutdown. So what are the key takeaways for the U.S. economy? COVID-19 cases and deaths appear to have stabilized across the U.S. Downside risk exists if a potential second wave leads to more shutdowns. We still think the U.S. economy will bottom in the second quarter. Most economists are forecasting a V-shaped recovery, but a U-shaped or even L-shaped outcome, those are still possible. The shape of recovery depends on the pace of reopening. Small business remains key. The recovery will be asymmetric by region and industry group. As you can see here today, fiscal and monetary stimulus is unprecedented. It only cushions the blow, though. It won't restart economic activity. We do think another stimulus deal is likely this summer, but at the end of the day, financial conditions remain very supportive at the moment. And then finally, the key takeaways from the PA economy, COVID-19 cases and deaths have also stabilized across the Commonwealth. Again, significant downside risk if we get a second wave that leads to more shutdowns. It should follow the U.S. economy into a bottom in second quarter. A V-shaped recovery is still possible here in PA as well. It's definitely at greater risk with extended stay-at-home orders. And again, the shape of the recovery here depends on the pace of reopening. So small businesses that are highest risk of permanent closure, previously strong sectors like the ones we had mentioned were hit the hardest. Ultimately, PA banks have held up very well, and sustained credit flow will cushion the blow here. But again, that also doesn't restart economic activity. So we'll be watching all of that. We would just note that diversity of the Pennsylvania economy is a strong stabilizer, and we view it as providing a support for a quicker recovery. So with all of that, I will pass it over to Eric Wenger to close.
All right, and thank you everybody for hanging with us. We know we're right here at the couple minutes after the hour. Our final question, and this question is optional. It's a question that says, please indicate whether you'd like RKL to follow up with you regarding any of these topics. Check any that apply. And the first would be any further PPP loan forgiveness computations, cash flow forecasting, any related questions on PPP, you can check that box. Second item, any sort of HR, personnel, payroll type matters. Third option, an investment review, financial planning, wealth management related topic. Next question is, I have some other questions, so please contact me. And finally, no follow-up is needed. And so if you'd like to indicate your response on that, that helps us to be able to gauge how best to connect with you during these times. And with that, we are all wrapped up. I'd just like to remind everybody, Sunday is Mother's Day, so don't forget. Make sure you honor your mom, and have a great weekend. Take care, everybody. Thanks. Bye-bye.